Carl Skinner is a name synonymous with firefighting and forest management in the United States. He began his career as a firefighter in Lassen County in 1968 and went on to become one of the most respected and accomplished scientists in his field. After an illustrious career spanning 42 years with the U.S. Forest Service, Carl retired in 2014, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire those who work in the field of fire science today. Carl Skinner's contributions to the field of fire science are numerous and far-reaching. He is particularly interested in the interplay between fire and climate, and his research in this area has helped to shape our understanding of how wildfires behave and how best to manage them. His work has been instrumental in the development of fire management strategies that are both effective and environmentally sustainable.
I'm Carl Skinner. I'm a research geographer with the U.S. Forest Service, retired now, and spent 42 years with the Forest Service, half of that in fire management and half of it in fire research. And during my fire research, the last, I would say 15, 20 years of it, I spent looking at how climate change that we are experiencing seem to be influencing changes in what fire is doing and how it affects our chances of having fire and what fire is likely to do. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. This is an interesting chart to me. This is basically looking at the amount of millions of acres burned on an annual basis from about 1915 or so until this one was 2012, I think was the last year that I had data for this particular one. I could update it, but it just keeps going. And what you see is that in the early years, there was, after we started fire suppression, you have somewhere in the 11 western states, somewhere around maybe 1 million to a little over 2 million acres a year burning, and then it drops off into the 1930s a bit, probably because of the CCCs were put into the forest and started doing more work. But then it really drops in the 50s. In the 1960s, we get a big drop in the amount of fires. Well, that was after World War II, and all of a sudden there's all these surplus bombers and trucks and dozers and all kinds of things. And a lot of that was given to the fire organizations. And so they got really good at putting fires out. But while they're doing that, vegetation's still growing. And what we see is that in the 1970s, it starts to tick back up again. And we're having two things happen at that time. We're having probably fuels accumulating over the period when we were doing a really good job of putting fires out. And we have climate change happening where temperatures are increasing. So the two of those are probably leading to this increase in fire activity that has continued to increase beyond this. What's interesting is that this is for the 11 western states. If you look at California alone, before fire suppression, there was between 4.5 and 12 million acres a year just in California would burn in the past before we started putting fires out. And we still have those beautiful forests. So here's what we see. This is Northern Hemisphere temperature. This is from the International Panel on Climate Change, report number 6. And what you see is this is down here would be what they would simulate if the temperatures would just continue on by natural processes without human interference with anything. This is basically stimulated by human activity, changing greenhouse gases and so forth, is what the models suggest is happening. And this right here is the period I just showed you in terms of the nature of the fire activity. And so we go from the early part of the 1900s, it's just kind of bouncing along, and then after the 1970s, boing, it's doing pretty much the same thing that we're seeing on the amount of fire activity that we're getting, area burned. So climate variation and fire. Temperature. What does temperature do? Temperature is mostly associated with fire frequency. The more you have warmer years, the more activity you can get, the more likely you are to get fires, because temperature dries out the fuels. Moisture mostly influences fire extent. And the reason for that is you need moisture to grow stuff. And so when you have good years of lots of moisture, you can grow a lot more than you can just under dry conditions. And so that's how they work together. And you often see that you have wet years, and then after that you might have some dry years. This is kind of the El Nino, La Nina type thing. El Ninos in the southwest bring a lot of moisture, and you grow lots of stuff, and then a few years later you get a La Nina, and that's when the fires break out, because that's the dry years. And we get some of that here. Where we are located here in Shasta County is in what's called the fulcrum between the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. And it's interesting because it depends on what the ocean currents are doing. Some years when it's an El Nino, we can get really quite wet. Say like in 98, I think it was, or 97. In that area, we had one of those years. It was an El Nino year, and it just deluged dust just like it did the rest of the Southwest. And then when there's a La Nina, we can be very dry, say like in 1977, a very, very dry year. But it can go the other way too. Some years we go like to Northwest, where when it's an El Nino, it's dry. And if it's a La Nina, they get wet. They're the opposite of the Southwest. And where we sit in Shasta County is right in the middle, and we can go either way. We've reconstructed a lot of past climates by looking at a lot of lakes. Yeah, I've worked with, this is Kathy Whitlock and one of her students. She's, at this time, she was at the University of Oregon. She may be retired by now, but at Montana State. And she and one of her students, Jerry Moore, they're coring the lake out there is what they're doing. And they're getting sediment cores. And they look at the layers over time in the lakes, and you can see how pollen changes, how, say, types of needles and vegetation stuff that settles into the lake change over time that way, and to tell how climates are changing. And these are all of the places that we worked on here in Northern California and Southwest Oregon. And what I did was I did tree ring work around these lakes, and to be able to calibrate the charcoal influxes that they were seeing into the lake, because you can also see that. And one of the things that's most interesting to me, and was to Kathy, was it doesn't matter where you look after the glaciers left until the 20th century. There's never a time without charcoal. There's always charcoal coming into these lakes, just sometimes more than others. And so that's very interesting. The 20th century has been actually similar to the Pleistocene. So anyway, this is how we figure it out. And so this lake gives you an idea that 14,000 years ago it was just ice and snow, and then the glaciers melted and it turned into something more like this, where you have lots of chaparral and a few trees that are moving in and that kind of thing. And then there was a really warm period, a very warm period, 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, that actually turned into oak and juniper. And this is up at high elevation and such. Then it started to change back again about 7,000 years ago into something with more trees. And then there was this very cool period, 2,000 to 1,000 years ago, that changed it into mostly fir dominated kind of thing. And then it turned into the present about 1,000 years ago. So that's how the current forests that we kind of think are probably been there eons and eons, they haven't been there that long. And it's because climate changes over time. And that's what we were trying to study. And what we found is that climate's always changing. It's just sometimes faster than at other times. And we happen to be right now in one of those times when it's changing incredibly fast compared to any time we see in the past. And so climate change and fire hasn't, climate's changed before. I get this question a lot from folks. Isn't that natural? Yeah, it is. But it never happened before when accompanied by nearly a century of fire suppression, saving up the fuel. The fires would just always burn in the past. And that's how we've changed things dramatically from any time in the past. And here's the thing I already showed you in the last talk, but I'll do it again. By John Liburg, the most potent factor in shaping the forest of the region has been and still is fire. The general character of the forest, in fact, almost every phase of its condition has been determined by fire. And that's because in the past, fires were just free to burn. Now here's something that we can see in the forest, and this gives us a sense of what the fires were doing. This is a Jeffrey pine. And what's interesting, though, is that most people, when they pass something like this along a trail, they'll say, oh, well, there was a fire here in the past. Actually, if you know what you're looking at, there's a whole lot more than a fire here in the past. See these crevices? Each one of those is a different fire as this tree was growing. And this particular tree has 33 of them that you can see that it survived over time. So that tells you that those fires were not severe fires that were going by. And so this is Alan Taylor. He's a colleague of mine at Penn State. And we do a lot of work together, and that's what he's looking at right there, some of those crevices, to see if we're going to collect this sample. And so then we do. And this is what you end up with, were samples that look like this. And you can see the different rings, the individual rings, which the light wood is spring wood, and then you get dark wood is late summer, and then there's the edge of the ring when they quit growing for the year. And you can see in them that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 scars that were put by fires on this tree that we have a sample of here. This one's right here at it looks like it's actually in the late wood, inside the late wood. So that means it's a late summer fire. This one's in early wood. That's a spring fire. And so you can actually, this one's at the boundary of the late wood. So it's, say, early fall probably, late summer, early fall, and so forth. And so we can actually not only tell which year the fires occurred in, but we can get a sense of the timing that the fires were occurring in. And then come up with something that looks like that, which this is from Hayfork, is where this came from. It's one of the places we've done a study. We've done them all over the place. And you can see there's a lot of very regular fire activity until 1902 is the last one. And then that's around when we started fire suppression. But if you get enough of these, you can put together something that looks like this. And it gives you a sense of how often fire is burning through the forest, not just where that tree is. And what you see here is these big years that line up like this show you where the larger fires, when the larger fires occurred. And then these other ones are smaller type situations. And I'll go into more detail in that on another talk. But these are the places that we've done that. And up and down California and clear into Baja and Southwest Oregon, throughout this Mediterranean climate zone, trying to understand how fire interacted with the landscapes in different places and how climate affected it. And that's where Scott Stevens, who's at UC Berkeley, came up with, off looking at all these data, the 4.5 million to 12 million acres a year is what likely burned in the past. Now this is variation in temperature for the Northern Hemisphere. And what's interesting, this is over the last 1,000 years, and this line is the average from 1961 to 1990 is what you're looking at. And so it's kind of just, they used it as a standard in this particular study. And this is also from the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel. And what you see is that most of the period was cooler until just recently. Basically, the early 1900s is when it really started to climb and stuff in terms of climate change. What's interesting about that, though, is that this is the period of the tree rings, telling us all of those fires that used to burn in the past were during this period, which was significantly cooler than what we're dealing with now. So what we ended up with, and what we've done with how we've managed, is this is actually from the Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest in the 1920s, is what it looked like when they were first setting up the experimental forest. And this is what it turned into by the 1990s because of keeping fire out of it. Fire exclusion has helped to lead to increasing stand density. And here's another example. This is from Lassen Park. This is Alan Taylor's work. And when they first set up Lassen Park, it's really interesting. They thought they had the foresight to put in plots at the corner of every section corner in the park and describe the vegetation and take photographs in the 4 cardinal directions. And then Alan got the contract to come back in 1992 and redo it. And here's the same place in 1992. That's the nature of the change. And here, there's no logging because it's in the national park, and there's no, grazing since the park has been formed and that. So you can't blame it on other things. It's just keeping fire out mostly. And so I like to show this slide because of the way the forest used to look. I think the Beaver Creek Pinery in the Ishii Wilderness area is interesting because it's about a section in size, a little over that, and yet there's this kind of diversity in it. And all of this burned in 1990 and again in 1994, and yet you have all of this kind of diversity, including almost total oak stands that are in there and stuff. And so this is what would be kind of representative of a lot of the forests in the past, is a lot of heterogeneity. And so from the air, it looks like this. You can see that there's a lot of breaking up, but then there are places where the crowns touch and so forth. And then there's places like this where the young trees are coming up and so forth. Here's another patch of young trees coming up. And another one of our experimental forests, which is in the Sierra, you can see how that's grown up into something like this. Because what you can see is, you can see where, here's one of those patches of what was the younger trees in between where the larger trees are, and how that changed over time. This is Stanislaus Tuolumne Experimental Forest just north of Yosemite. And so that's what we have provided for with our management practices, is for forests to change like this during a period of rapid climate change that is warming and creating conditions where that really wants to burn. Now this is an interesting one. This comes from the Goddard Institute for Space Science. And this is what they've done, is they've taken temperature data from all over the Earth, and it's primarily concentrated in the northern hemisphere because that's where most of the data come from. And they have shown you from 1880 through 2022 what the temperatures are doing on a month-by-month basis, because they actually have records for this. This isn't from tree rings or some other way. This is actually from records. And what I thought was interesting was, if you look at the period, this would have been summer in the past, in the 1880s, which basically ran from, say, June into August, maybe almost September or something. But that's when the temperatures kind of leveled off for that warm period of the year and then started back down again. But if you look at those same temperatures or higher now, they cover that much of the year now, is where they are. Now they go from April through October, which means fire season, the period when you can support fires, has increased tremendously from what it used to be. And that's what a lot of the firefighters are saying now. Geez, it seems like fire season never ends anymore. And this is one of the reasons for that. So, fire and climate change, where are we headed? What we're seeing is that fire seasons are definitely getting longer. The first study I saw that came out on this came out around the year 2000, and they were suggesting at that time that fire seasons throughout the West averaged 70 to 80 days longer than it had just in 1970. So only over a 30-year period it had changed that much. The fuels keep growing, so that makes a greater probability of intense fires. It's not if, but when you get the fire because of our risk. We always have the risk of fire. It's simple physics. There's the fire triangle, the heat, oxygen, and fuel is basically what you need for fire. And what we're doing is providing a whole lot more of this, and we're maintaining most of that and haven't done significant about it. And so we end up with places that are looking like this more and more. And they have a tendency to burn again. Lightning will come in and hit those old dead snags and stuff. This one up here is in the marbles, and this is in the Sierra, but just examples. And then what you get, this was in the Trinity Alps. This is after they go through the second time. And this was just 10 years after the first fire. This was the Bear Fire that followed the Megram Fire in the Trinities. And so what you see if you go in and look at it on the ground is there's all the seedlings for the few trees that survived the first one that were trying to come up in there, but now they're blasted. And so it's essentially having a tendency to turn landscapes into very different kinds of vegetation. And that's one of the things Alan and I have noticed in some of our recent work is that what we used to think when places burned, that they were probably not likely to burn for quite a while after that again. But we're seeing now, because of the increased temperatures and the increased drying that brings, that a lot of these places are actually ready to burn within a few years. And we had a real extreme example of that here in Redding, that with the Zog fire that burned just a couple of years after the Carr fire and was still a significant fire and caused life lost and a lot of damage. And so that's what we're seeing, is that these repeated fires are now changing landscapes. And one example is Hat Creek. You can see it from the Hat Creek Rim Vista Point, and what's happening there throughout. All this is burned now. You have all this burned down through in here, and then you can see everything up through the rim here is burned. And it's been, some of it, multiple times, just since 1987. So, where are we headed? We're getting larger areas of high intensity. I mean, the Dixie Fire was amazing. It's almost 1 million acres, and we found that it was 50% of it was the highest severity level. And they're having a tendency to reburn before full recovery. So we're converting forests to non-forests, promoting shrub and grasslands that have a tendency to want to keep burning and such. And kind of worried about where we're going with our forests if we don't manage them in different ways. Anyway, thank you very much. That's my crew. When we were up having lunch after working in the Ashland watershed up in Southern Oregon. Glenn's always telling stories. And so that's what we're laughing at. Thank you.